July 20th, 1944. The briefing room at Wolf's Lair shuddered as Klaus von Stauffenberg's bomb detonated beneath the map table. 4 men died in the blast. Adolf Hitler, standing just feet from the explosion, survived with a perforated eardrum and shredded trousers. Within hours, the news rippled across the world through radio broadcasts and intelligence channels. In Moscow, as Joseph Stalin received the reports, his reaction surprised those who expected him to rage at the missed opportunity. Instead, he smiled. The news reached Stalin through multiple channels that evening. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, had picked up German radio traffic indicating something catastrophic had occurred at Hitler's headquarters. The NKVD's foreign intelligence networks, which had sources embedded in various German resistance circles, began sending urgent cables. Then came the official German announcement. An assassination attempt had failed, Hitler lived, and a purge had begun. Stalin was in his Kremlin office when Lavrentiy Beria brought him the initial reports. The Soviet dictator read through the intelligence summaries, his pipe clenched between his teeth, his face showing none of the emotion those around him anticipated. Beria waited, expecting orders, perhaps instructions to reach out to the conspirators, to exploit the chaos. Instead, Stalin set down the papers and spoke words that revealed the cold logic beneath his wartime strategy. "It's better this way," he said. "Hitler will fight to the end." These Prussian generals would try to make peace with the West. That single statement contained the entire architecture of Stalin's thinking about Germany, about his Western allies, and about how the war must end. To understand why Stalin preferred Hitler alive required understanding the man's profound cynicism about power, his strategic vision for post-war Europe, and his deep suspicion of everyone, including those who claimed to be his allies. The timing of the assassination attempt was significant. On July 20th, 1944, the Eastern Front was experiencing the greatest German catastrophe of the entire war. Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive that had begun on June 23rd, was systematically destroying Army Group Center. Soviet forces had liberated Minsk on July 3rd and were now driving toward Poland and the borders of the Reich itself. German casualties in Bagration would ultimately reach between 300,000 and 400,000 men, with entire divisions ceasing to exist. Stalin had been monitoring the offensive's progress with intense satisfaction. The Red Army was demonstrating its evolution from the desperate defender of 1941 into an offensive machine that could coordinate multiple army groups across hundreds of miles. The Germans were retreating, their once vaunted Wehrmacht broken by Soviet artillery, tanks, and the sheer weight of men and material the Soviet Union could now bring to bear. Into this context came the news that German officers had tried to kill Hitler. For Stalin, this was not a welcome development. It was a complication. The Soviet dictator had been receiving intelligence about German resistance movements for years. The NKVD had files on various opposition circles, on the Kreisau circle of intellectuals, on military officers who questioned Hitler's strategy, on diplomats who sought contacts with the West. Stalin viewed all of them with contempt. They were not potential allies. They were a threat to his post-war plans. Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister and closest associate, later recalled the dictator's reasoning. Stalin said the conspirators were Prussian reactionaries who wanted to save Germany from complete defeat. They would try to split the alliance, make a separate peace with America and Britain, turn the Wehrmacht against us. Hitler would never do that. Hitler would fight until Berlin burned. This was the crucial calculation. Stalin did not want a negotiated peace. He did not want a reformed Germany that could appeal to Western sympathies. He wanted total victory, unconditional surrender, and a Germany so thoroughly destroyed that it could never threaten the Soviet Union again. Hitler, in his fanaticism, would deliver exactly that. The conspirators of July 20th represented everything Stalin distrusted about the German military aristocracy. They were men like Klaus von Stauffenberg, a count from an old Swabian family, like Ludwig Beck, former chief of the German General Staff, like Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig. These were not revolutionaries. They were conservatives who had supported Hitler's early conquests but now sought to preserve Germany from the consequences of total defeat. Stalin had studied their profiles. He knew their backgrounds, their politics, their connections to Western diplomats. Soviet intelligence had monitored the resistance's attempts to establish contact with the British and Americans. These contacts terrified Stalin far more than Hitler's continued leadership of Germany. The Soviet dictator's greatest fear in 1944 was not German military power, which was clearly broken, but rather a separate peace between Germany and the Western Allies. He imagined a scenario where a post-Hitler government, led by Wehrmacht officers and conservative politicians, would appeal to the West with promises of democracy and cooperation against Bolshevism. Churchill and Roosevelt might be tempted. The alliance might fracture. The Red Army might find itself fighting alone or worse, facing a coalition of former enemies and former allies. Hitler eliminated that possibility. Hitler would never surrender. His ideology demanded total victory or total destruction. He had made that clear in speech after speech, in his treatment of generals who suggested strategic withdrawals, in his increasingly unhinged orders as the military situation deteriorated. Hitler was predictable in his fanaticism. A new German government would be unpredictable in its pragmatism. Stalin expressed this logic to his inner circle with characteristic bluntness. "Hitler is a fool, but a useful fool," he reportedly said in discussions following the assassination attempt. "He will destroy Germany for us. These generals who tried to kill him, they are more dangerous. They would try to save something from the wreckage." The Soviet press coverage of the July 20th plot reflected Stalin's cynicism. While Western newspapers treated the assassination attempt as a dramatic story of resistance to tyranny, Soviet papers gave it minimal coverage and framed it as infighting among fascist criminals. There was no suggestion that the conspirators deserved sympathy or support. They were portrayed as rats fighting over a sinking ship, nothing more. This public dismissal served Stalin's purposes. He did not want the Soviet people developing any sympathy for good Germans who opposed Hitler. The entire propaganda apparatus of the Soviet state had spent 3 years depicting Germans as subhuman invaders who had burned villages, murdered civilians, and committed atrocities across Soviet territory. The narrative was simple. Germans were the enemy, all Germans, and they would be punished collectively. The existence of German resistance complicated that narrative. Behind the scenes, Stalin's intelligence services tracked the purge that followed the assassination attempt with great interest. Hitler's revenge was swift and savage. Approximately 5,000 people were arrested in the weeks after July 20th. Around 200 were executed, many after-show trials designed to humiliate them. Others were tortured to death or sent to concentration camps. The purge reached deep into the Wehrmacht's officer corps, the civil service, and even peripherally connected families. For Stalin, this purge was a gift. Every experienced German officer who was arrested, tortured, or executed was one less competent leader the Wehrmacht could field against the Red Army. The paranoia that swept through German military headquarters after July 20th mirrored the paranoia Stalin had inflicted on his own officer corps during the Great Purge of 1937-1938. Stalin had crippled the Red Army's leadership in those years, executing thousands of officers, including most of the high command. Now Hitler was doing the same to the Wehrmacht. The irony was not lost on Stalin. He had nearly destroyed the Soviet military through his purges, leaving it vulnerable to the German invasion of 1941. Now, in 1944, Hitler was purging his own military at the moment when Germany needed experienced leadership most desperately. Stalin saw his own mistakes being repeated by his enemy, and he was pleased. There was a deeper psychological dimension to Stalin's reaction. The dictator identified with Hitler in certain ways, though he would never have admitted it. Both were absolute rulers who had risen from humble origins to command vast empires. Both had purged their own parties and militaries. Both distrusted their generals and insisted on personal control of military strategy. Both believed themselves to be historical figures of destiny. Stalin understood Hitler's mindset because it resembled his own in key respects. He knew Hitler would not delegate power to generals, would not accept advice that contradicted his own judgment, would not admit mistakes or accept defeat. These characteristics, which had contributed to German defeats on the Eastern Front, would continue to hamstring German strategy as long as Hitler lived. A new German leader, particularly one from the military, might be more rational, might conduct strategic withdrawals to defensible positions, might husband resources instead of squandering them in futile counterattacks, might seek diplomatic solutions instead of fighting to the last man. Stalin wanted none of that. He wanted the irrational Hitler, making irrational decisions, leading Germany to irrational destruction. The strategic situation in July 1944 reinforced Stalin's preference for Hitler's survival. The Red Army was advancing on all fronts. In the north, Leningrad had been fully relieved. In the center, Operation Bagration was destroying Army Group Center and driving toward Poland. In the south, Soviet forces were pushing into Romania and threatening the Balkans. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy on June 6th and were fighting through France. Germany was clearly losing the war. The question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but how, when, and by whom. Stalin wanted the Red Army to be the primary instrument of Germany's defeat. He wanted Soviet forces to occupy as much German territory as possible before the war ended. He wanted the final battle for Berlin to be a Soviet victory, not a negotiated surrender to a coalition. Hitler's survival ensured that scenario. A post-Hitler government might surrender to the Western Allies specifically, might open the Western Front while trying to hold the East, might negotiate terms that limited Soviet occupation. Hitler would do none of these things. Hitler would fight the Red Army street by street, giving Stalin time to position Soviet forces throughout Eastern Europe and deep into Germany itself. The conversations Stalin had with his military commanders in the days after July 20th reflected this strategic thinking. Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most successful general, was directing operations in Belarus. Konstantin Rokossovsky was pushing toward Warsaw. Ivan Konev was preparing offensives in Ukraine. Stalin's instructions to all of them remained unchanged by Hitler's survival. Maintain pressure, advance as quickly as possible, give the Germans no time to establish new defensive lines. But there was a subtle shift in emphasis. Stalin stressed the importance of speed not just for military reasons, but for political ones. The race was not just to defeat Germany, but to occupy German territory before the Western Allies could. Every day Hitler remained in power, continuing his futile resistance, was another day the Red Army could advance westward. Stalin's satisfaction with Hitler's survival was also connected to his view of the Western Allies. The Soviet dictator never fully trusted Churchill or Roosevelt. He saw the alliance as temporary, a marriage of convenience that would end once Germany was defeated. He suspected the West of seeking ways to limit Soviet gains, to preserve German power as a counterweight to Soviet influence in Europe. The July 20th plot confirmed these suspicions in Stalin's mind. Soviet intelligence reported that some conspirators had been in contact with Western officials. Alan Dulles, the American intelligence officer in Switzerland, had met with German resistance representatives. British intelligence had received feelers from opposition circles. To Stalin, this proved the West was considering alternatives to unconditional surrender, alternatives that might exclude Soviet interests. If Hitler had died and a new government had taken power in Germany, Stalin feared that government would immediately approach the Western Allies with peace proposals. They would offer to surrender in the West while continuing to fight in the East. They would appeal to Western anti-communism, suggesting that a defeated but intact Germany could serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Churchill, who Stalin knew harbored deep anti-Soviet sentiments, might be tempted. Hitler's survival eliminated this scenario. There would be no peace proposals, no separate negotiations, no attempts to split the alliance. Hitler would fight everyone until the end. The alliance would hold together through the final destruction of Nazi Germany. And when that destruction was complete, the Red Army would be positioned throughout Eastern Europe, its occupation zones determined by military facts on the ground rather than diplomatic negotiations. Beria, who understood Stalin's thinking better than most, later described the dictator's reaction to the assassination attempt as one of relief disguised as indifference. Stalin had not wanted Hitler to die, but he could not appear pleased that Hitler lived, as that would seem perverse. So he affected a pose of cold analysis, presenting his preference for Hitler's survival as pure strategic calculation rather than personal satisfaction. The reality was more complex. Stalin's emotions about Hitler were layered. He hated Hitler for launching the invasion that had devastated the Soviet Union, killed millions of Soviet citizens, and nearly destroyed Stalin's own power. But he also respected Hitler's will to power, his ability to command absolute loyalty, his ruthlessness in eliminating rivals. Stalin saw in Hitler a distorted mirror image of himself. More importantly, Stalin needed Hitler. Not as a military opponent, for by July 1944 the Wehrmacht was clearly beaten, but as a political foil. Hitler's continued leadership of Germany justified Soviet actions, legitimized Soviet demands, and provided cover for Soviet expansion. As long as Hitler lived, Stalin could present himself to the Western Allies as the indispensable partner in destroying Nazism. The moment Hitler died, that dynamic would change. The weeks after July 20th confirmed Stalin's judgment. Hitler's purge of the officer corps was even more extensive than initial reports suggested. The Gestapo arrested anyone with even tangential connections to the conspirators. Families were destroyed under the principle of Sippenhaft, collective punishment. The Wehrmacht's command structure was paralyzed by fear and suspicion. Officers hesitated to give honest assessments or suggest strategic withdrawals, knowing that defeatism was now punishable by death. Soviet forces exploited this paralysis ruthlessly. Operation Bagration continued to roll forward. By August, the Red Army had reached the Vistula River and was approaching Warsaw. In the south, Soviet forces entered Romania, knocking Germany's most important ally out of the war. The pace of advance exceeded even Stalin's expectations. In September, as Soviet forces paused to consolidate their gains and prepare for the final offensives into Germany itself, Stalin reflected on the previous months with satisfaction. Hitler's survival had indeed served Soviet interests. The purge had weakened German military leadership. The continued fanatical resistance had given the Red Army time to occupy vast territories. The Western Allies, still fighting in France and Italy, had not reached German territory, while Soviet forces were now positioned on Germany's borders. Stalin's statement that "it's better this way" proved prophetic. The final 9 months of the war in Europe unfolded exactly as he had calculated. Hitler refused all suggestions of surrender or strategic withdrawal. He ordered counter-offensives that squandered Germany's remaining resources. He insisted on defending every inch of territory, leading to encirclements and mass surrenders. He remained in Berlin as Soviet forces closed in, ensuring that the final battle would be a Soviet victory. By April 1945, as the Red Army fought through Berlin's streets toward the Führerbunker, Stalin's preference for Hitler's survival had been completely vindicated. Soviet forces occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Eastern Germany. The Red Army had planted the Soviet flag on the Reichstag. The political map of post-war Europe was being drawn by military occupation, and the Soviet Union's occupation zone was vast. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. When Stalin received the news, his reaction was again surprising to those around him. He did not celebrate. He ordered his intelligence services to confirm the death absolutely, suspecting Hitler might have escaped. He wanted Hitler's body found and identified beyond doubt. For days, Stalin refused to believe Hitler was truly dead. He suspected the Western allies of hiding Hitler, of planning to use him as a bargaining chip. The paranoia that had shaped his entire political life now focused on Hitler's fate. Soviet forces searched frantically for definitive proof. When Hitler's burned corpse was finally identified through dental records, Stalin still expressed skepticism publicly. In conversations with Western leaders at Potsdam in July 1945, he suggested Hitler might have escaped to Spain or Argentina. This was partly genuine paranoia, partly political theater. Stalin wanted to keep the Hitler threat alive in Western minds, to justify continued Soviet military presence in occupied territories, but privately, Stalin acknowledged that Hitler's death marked the end of an era. The useful fool was gone. The enemy who had served Soviet interests through his fanaticism and incompetence had destroyed himself and his regime. Stalin had gotten everything he wanted: total German defeat, vast Soviet occupation zones, and a post-war position of strength in Europe. Looking back at his reaction to the July 20th assassination attempt, Stalin's cold calculation had been correct in every detail. Hitler's survival had led directly to the outcome Stalin desired. A more rational German leadership might have prolonged the war through better strategy, or shortened it through negotiation. Either scenario would have been worse for Soviet interests than Hitler's continued command. The irony was profound. The man who hated Hitler most, who had suffered most from Hitler's invasion, who had the strongest motive to want Hitler dead, had been relieved when Hitler survived an assassination attempt, not out of any sympathy, but out of pure strategic self-interest. Stalin understood that sometimes your worst enemy is more useful alive than dead, if his continued existence serves your larger purposes. This was the essence of Stalin's genius and his monstrosity. He could separate emotion from calculation so completely that he preferred his mortal enemy's survival because that enemy's incompetence served his goals. He could look at an assassination attempt that might have shortened the war and saved thousands of lives and conclude it was better that it failed because the prolonged war served Soviet strategic interests. The officers who tried to kill Hitler on July 20th, 1944, believed they were saving Germany and perhaps shortening the war. They failed, and Hitler's purge destroyed them and thousands of others. But in a twisted way, their failure served one purpose. It ensured that Nazi Germany would be destroyed so thoroughly that it could never threaten anyone again. Stalin had wanted that outcome, and Hitler's survival had delivered it. When Stalin died in 1953, he left behind a Soviet Union that dominated half of Europe. That domination was built on the ruins of Nazi Germany, ruins created in large part by Hitler's fanatical refusal to accept defeat. The seeds of Soviet post-war power were planted in July 1944, when Stalin learned Hitler had survived and smiled, knowing that the useful fool would continue destroying himself and everything around him. It was a cold calculation from a cold man in a war that had already killed tens of millions, and it was proven correct by everything that followed.